Half a world away from the Tigris and the Euphrates, in the highlands that are now southeastern Iran, somebody once carved 100 details about a city that no living person has ever stood in. The rulers of Sumer wrote its name across 5 different clay tablets. They left marching orders to reach it. They named its kings. They described its walls, its temples, the metals that came out of its hills, and the lapis lazuli that glittered in its shrines. The Sumerians built a war around it. They invented writing, supposedly just to send a message to it. Then, almost nothing. The stones vanished. The temples disappeared. The hills themselves seemed to close over whatever had once stood there, and for more than 4,000 years, every scholar who went looking came back empty-handed. The city is called Arata, and 4,000 years after it disappeared, the inscriptions are still pointing at a place we cannot find. How do you lose a city that an entire civilization cared about? How does a place that Sumerian kings went to war over, that merchants built trade routes to reach, that poets sang about in some of the oldest poems ever written, simply vanish from the surface of the earth? That question has haunted Assyriologists for more than a century, and it still has no clean answer. The Sumerians left behind hundreds of thousands of clay tablets. They wrote down everything. They wrote down grain receipts and business deals and the names of kings. And in all of that writing, they kept coming back to one strange place. A faraway land of gold and silver and shining stone. A place that sounds almost too good to be true. A place called Arata. To most people, Sumer is Egypt's quieter cousin, the first civilization, the one that invented writing, the one that built the ziggurats. You learn about Sumer in a schoolbook paragraph and you move on. But Sumer was not a single city. It was a network of city-states, each with its own king, each with its own temple, each competing with the others for land, for water, for prestige, for the attention of the gods. Uruk, Ur, Kish, Lagash, Nippur, Eridu. These are the names you find in textbooks, and then there is Arata. Arata is the strangest name on that list because every textbook treats it as if it does not belong. Uruk has a tell, a great mound of broken brick that archaeologists have been digging into for more than 100 years. Ur has a tell, and Eridu has a tell, and Lagash has a tell, and Nippur has a tell. Every Sumerian city has left behind a hill that marks exactly where it once stood, a hill that surveyors can find with a theodolite and a guidebook to the previous century's trenches. Arata has no tell. Arata has nothing. Arata is a name attached to a hole in the archaeological map, a place the record insists must have existed, and yet refuses to leave any mark on the ground for modern surveyors to walk up to and begin digging on, the way they have dug on every other Sumerian city the textbooks remember. When you look at where the ancient sources say Arata should be, things get stranger. The Sumerians did not write vague directions. They wrote specific itineraries. They named mountains. They named rivers. They listed the marching days between one place and the next with the same precision a modern travel writer might use for a guidebook to a country that still exists. And when you follow those itineraries, they do not lead to a known Sumerian city. They do not lead to a known Babylonian city either. They lead off the alluvial plain into the Zagros Mountains to the east, into highlands that, thousands of years later, would become Iran. That is a long way to walk, just to have your trade caravans robbed and your messengers turned back. So either the Sumerians were making the whole thing up, which would be strange for a culture so obsessed with record-keeping that they wrote down the daily barley ration of temple servants, or there really was something glittering and wealthy on the other side of those mountains. For more than 100 years, scholars have been arguing about which of those two answers is the right one. The story of how this question got reopened begins, oddly enough, with floods. In early 2001, a series of severe floods hit the Kerman and Sistan provinces of southeastern Iran. The Halil River, normally a quiet stream that farmers could step across in their sandals, swelled into a torrent that tore through villages, orchards, and farmland in a single night, an act of weather that would have looked ordinary on the Euphrates, and looked apocalyptic in the narrow valleys around Dairoft. When the water finally receded, the riverbanks had been stripped clean of the silt and sand that had covered them for generations, and underneath that washed ground, farmers found something they had no name for. Painted gray pottery, carved chlorite vessels, weird soapstone figurines shaped like animals, serpents, and hybrid creatures. Thousands of objects, each one more elaborate than the last. They called the style after a local village, and they called the wider archaeological area after a nearby modern city whose name had once belonged only to a regional bazaar town. Within a few years, the Dairoft civilization had a name, a place on the map, and a museum in Tehran dedicated to objects that nobody outside Iran had ever seen. Within 5 years of those floods, archaeologists had uncovered a burial site that contained object after object of pure gold. Golden bowls decorated with mythological scenes of scorpion men and horned serpents, vessels carved from stone so fine the figures looked almost alive. beakers and cups and goblets and beautifully worked bracelets, the kind of metalwork that historians had only ever described in Sumerian poetry and never expected to actually hold in their hands. The dating pushed everything back earlier than anyone had guessed. The Giraffe civilization was active in the 3rd millennium BCE. The same broad window as Sumer, the same broad window as early dynastic Egypt, the same broad window as the Indus Valley. It was not an offshoot of any of those places. It looked, on first examination, like a peer civilization that had been hiding in plain sight for 2 centuries of modern archaeology, unrecognized because nobody had been looking for it on this particular stretch of river. Most archaeologists, when they first heard about Giraffe, treated it as a regional curiosity, a small Bronze Age culture that had flourished for a few hundred years and then quietly disappeared back into the mountains. That kind of thing happened often enough in the archaeology of the ancient Near East that no one was especially alarmed. Regional cultures bloomed and vanished all the time, and most of them left nothing behind that anybody could read. But then the artifacts kept turning up. They turned up not just in Iran, but in markets in Paris, in New York, and Tokyo. Looters, working faster than any official excavation, were smuggling Giraffe objects onto the international antiquities market and selling them for prices that suggested the world's collectors had been starving for a new ancient civilization to argue about, to own, and to display in glass cases. Some of those objects were identical to objects found in Mesopotamia, in what is now Iraq. That detail was confusing. If Giraffe and Sumer really had been peer civilizations in their own right, why did their material culture look so similar in places? Why did Sumerian kings appear in Giraffe carvings that had no obvious reason to flatter a foreign ruler? Why did the lapis lazuli in Sumerian jewelry match the chemical signature of lapis from the Badakhshan mines, but also match a stone that Giraffe artisans seemed to be using in equal abundance, as if the highland civilization had its own private pipeline to the same quarries the lowland priests drew upon? And underneath all of those questions, the older question from the Sumerian tablets kept pressing. Did the Sumerians know about Giraffe? Did they name it? Did they call it Arata? Was the city the poets had been talking about for centuries the same civilization the floods had just uncovered a few seasons of digging away from? Piotr Steinkeller, a professor of Assyriology at Harvard, is the scholar most closely associated with that idea. In a 2007 paper, he made a careful, technical argument built up out of clay tablets and modern geological surveys, working line by line through the Enmerkar poems and the known mineralogy of the Halil Basin. The Sumerian texts, he noted, describe Arata as a place that supplied precious metals and precious stones to the kings of Mesopotamia. They call it a place of skilled artisans. They give it a complicated geography, with mountains, with rivers, with multiple stops on the road from Sumer, and with at least one named stop that scholars had long identified with the historical city of Susa in the foothills. Steinkeller compared that description, point by point, with what was then known about the Halil River Basin in southeastern Iran. On geography, on trade goods, on the timing of cultural development, the match was surprisingly good. The basin sits between 2 ranges of mountains in roughly the position the poems imply. It has the right combination of copper sources, the right geological context for gold placers, and a river system the scale of the poem's descriptions. Steinkeller did not say he had found Arata. He said something more careful. He said that the Halil Basin was the most plausible candidate for the place the Sumerians had in mind when they wrote the name Arata, an honest scholarly hedge that recognizes the limits of the evidence without backing away from the implications of the pattern. Other scholars have agreed. Other scholars have disagreed. The argument is still live, and the reason it is still live is that nobody has yet finished digging. Until somebody turns a trowel into a sealed floor and finds a seal that reads Imgi Arata in unmistakable cuneiform, the identification has to remain a working hypothesis rather than a proven fact. To understand why the Sumerians cared so much about this one city, you have to understand what they thought they were getting from it. Reread the relevant tablets, and a pattern jumps out. Arata is never mentioned as a source of grain. It is never mentioned as a source of livestock. It is mentioned over and over as a source of metal and stone. Gold and silver and copper, lapis lazuli and carnelian and alabaster. These are not farm products. These are trade products. They come from a place deep in the mountains, a place the caravans had to cross dangerous terrain to reach, and they are valuable precisely because they were not lying around on the southern plains. And that is exactly the picture modern archaeology has been filling in for Giraffe, which sits in some of the most rugged terrain in Iran, surrounded by mountains on 3 sides, sitting near the sources of several important metal ores, and almost jokingly close to the one place in the world where lapis of a particular deep blue can still be mined in the same stratigraphic layer that Bronze Age craftsmen would have reached. The Sumerian poems that mention Arata are not small texts. They are long, polished, repeated. The whole cycle is sometimes called the Matter of Arata, after the Matter of Britain, because scholars decided the Sumerians treated the city the way medieval Europeans treated King Arthur's kingdom. They went back to it again and again, the way poets go back to Troy, the way later poets would go back to Thebes, the way medieval singers went back to Rome. The oldest of the poems is Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata, more than 1,100 lines long, set during the reign of a king whose name may be historical and may not. The next in the cycle is Lugalbanda and the Anzu bird, and after that Lugalbanda in the mountain cave, and after that Enmerkar and the siege of Arata. 4 poems, one city, the same distant city that nobody could quite reach. Read Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata straight through, and you meet a king with a real problem. Uruk has grown wealthy. Uruk needs precious metals and stones for its temples, especially for the temple of Inanna, the goddess of love and war, who is also the patron of the city and whose moods could decide whether a season ended in harvest or in siege. And Merkar wants Arata's gold, silver, lapis, and alabaster. Arata wants Uruk's barley, the rich alluvial grain that the southern plains grew in such abundance that a haul of a few thousand bushels could finance an entire embassy. So a bargain gets made, or a war starts, and the war seems to drag on forever because Arata is so hard to reach. The war is not the interesting part. The interesting part is what Enmerkar supposedly invents in order to settle it. He invents writing. That is the Sumerian story about the origin of writing. Not accountants, not grain receipts, not a school for scribes. A message between 2 kings sent across a continent requiring a new invention to deliver without losing the meaning on the way. The story goes that Enmerkar's messenger, after years of marching, finally arrives at Arata and delivers a verbal message so long that the Lord of Arata cannot keep it all straight in his head. He asks for it in writing. The messenger dips a reed in pigment. He marks lines on a piece of clay. And so writing begins, on this telling, not to keep track of barley, but to make sure a king on the other side of a continent hears the right words. It is a beautiful story, and almost certainly wrong as history. Writing in Sumer shows up on clay tablets long before the kind of diplomacy the epic describes, and the practical needs of record-keeping, not royal correspondence, almost certainly drove the invention. Receipts came before treaties. Accountants came before ambassadors. The temple's storehouse came before the king's chancellery. But the fact that the Sumerians chose to attach the origin of writing to Arata tells you something about how important this city was to them. When they wanted to explain themselves to themselves, they reached for the most important invention of their age, and they tied it to a place they had probably never seen with their own eyes. What did the Sumerian poets think Arata looked like? Pulling passages from the epic together, you get a vivid picture, even if it is not a literal map. Arata sat in a high valley surrounded by mountains. Its walls were decorated with lapis lazuli and bitumen, the bright blue stone shining against the black paste the way nothing else in the 3rd millennium could shine. Its temple to Inanna gleamed with precious metal. Its people were skilled metalworkers, the kind of craftsmen whose trade names you find attached to individual objects on the rare surviving inventories, men whose reputations outlasted them on the road for decades after their hands had gone still. They carved images. They made offerings to the goddess. They had their own king, whose name changes across the tablets, but whose role stays the same. He is the Lord of Arata, the counterpart to Enmerkar, and his crown sparkles with gold. He is not a foreigner in the epic's moral universe, only a foreigner in its geography. The city fed itself on wheat that grew wild because a Sumerian storm god sent it to Arata as a gift. The hills around the city roasted barley for the people to eat. The city, on some readings of the text, is more or less a paradise, a mountain Shangri-La, the place where barley ripens without being planted, where the metals the rest of the world fights over are stacked in piles behind the temple, where craftsmen get gold on credit and pay back in objects the gods themselves would be proud to wear. That is the kind of description you would expect to find in a myth. That is the kind of description an entirely fictional city in a fairy tale would receive. So why have so many scholars worked so hard for so long to take it literally? The reason is that the geography is too specific to be pure invention. The route Enmerkar's messenger takes in the epic is also the route taken by other travelers recorded in other texts. The messenger goes through the Zubi Mountains. The Zubi Mountains have been identified, tentatively, with part of the Zagros. After the mountains, the messenger reaches Susa. Susa is not a myth. Susa was a real city, and we have been digging there for more than 100 years. After Susa, the messenger crosses 7 more mountain ranges before reaching Arata, and once you sum up those mountain ranges on a real map, on the real southeastern face of the Zagros, his route ends in a region we call today the Kerman province of Iran. That is where the Jiroft culture is, and that is where Steinkeller's argument starts to bite. The geography of the poems lines up, range by range, with the geography of modern Iran, and the cultural profile of Jiroft lines up, object by object, with the cultural profile of Arata. 2 independent kinds of evidence, pointing at the same narrow stretch of highland. The poet and the archaeologist are reading the same country, 4,000 years apart, and reaching the same conclusion about where the center of the highlands must have lain. Now, if you want to make this story stranger, You can take another step, which is what makes the mystery of Arata genuinely haunting rather than merely puzzling. Look at Lugalbanda and the Anzu bird. This is the second poem of the Arata cycle, and it picks up where the first left off. Enmerkar is still at war with Arata. He sends his young general Lugalbanda ahead with scouts, a risky piece of staff work in the 3rd millennium. Lugalbanda gets sick in the mountains. His men leave him behind. He's alone, half dead, in the high country between Sumer and Arata. And then a giant bird, the Anzu bird, a creature massive enough to block out the sun, lands beside him and somehow, instead of eating him, talks to him. He spends 8 days in the mountains alone but fed by the Anzu bird. He recovers. He presses on. He reaches Arata. And on his return journey, he plays another strange trick. He hides in a mountain cave, persuades the people of the city to treat him as a sick and dying man, and waits in their homes, eating only certain foods and not others until his strength returns. A piece of folk medicine disguised as narrative that sounds oddly familiar to anyone who has spent long enough in the highlands. Taken seriously as geography, that story is implausible. But taken seriously as a memory of what it was actually like for an ancient envoy to climb into the Zagros, get sick, be cared for by strangers, and walk half a year to reach the end of the road, it is eerily accurate. Susa turned out to be real. The Zubi Mountains turned out to be Zagros foothills. The Halil River Basin has the right mineralogy. The archaeology of the area is now coming back with more detail every year, and as it does, the old myths keep looking less mythological and more like descriptions of journeys someone actually took, with all the strangeness of a real trip pushed through the filter of poetic memory. Even the Anzu bird might just be a golden eagle, large enough to frighten a feverish traveler, interpreted through the lens of a poet who had long since left the mountains behind him and only remembered them in image. There is another detail you do not see written about in the popular accounts, but matters enormously. The Sumerians did not just describe Arata in long poems, they listed it in short ones too. A series of lexical lists, the kind of school text used to train scribes, includes Arata as a place name, alongside other distant places the scribes were expected to know by heart. Several Sumerian proverbs mention Arata, usually as a byword for distance or for richness. There is even a Sumerian saying recorded in clay that translates roughly as what is going on in Arata. This is the kind of saying that only makes sense if your audience has a working mental image of the place. The phrase presupposes that everyone listening knows Arata exists. It is the ancient equivalent of what is happening in Timbuktu, a real city behind a proverb. In other words, not a fictional place behind a metaphor. The proverb could not work if no one had a clear idea where Arata was, or at least what kind of place it was. And then there is the tin, if you will forgive a small geological note. Tin, in the 3rd millennium, was the rarest strategic metal on Earth. Bronze, the alloy that made weapons and tools and the entire military revolution of the era possible, was a mixture of copper and tin has a strange distribution. There are very few ancient tin mines in the world. Several of the best candidates are in Central Asia, others are in the highlands of Iran. And the Sumerian texts say, in their usual roundabout way, that tin came to Mesopotamia from distant places, by way of traders and ports along the Persian Gulf. The most credible modern maps of those ancient tin routes put them either directly through the Iranian highlands, where Jiroft is, or right next to them. So when the Sumerian texts describe Arata as a land of metals, a land whose artisans shaped the rare stuff of the world, they may have meant something very specific. They may have meant the most important strategic metal of their age. They may have meant the geological reason a small highland city mattered more in the schemes of kings far away than its size alone would ever have justified. Tin made bronze. Bronze made empires. Tin ran out fast. And whoever controlled the tin could break the empires of their rivals with a single embargo. You can also flip the story around and ask what made scholars doubt. The first reason historians dismissed Arata as legend is that, despite the geography, the texts, and the trade descriptions, almost nobody ever found any trace of the actual place on the ground. Surveys of the Iranian highlands in the 20th century turned up some very early agricultural sites, but nothing that looked like a city of the scale the poems implied. And the text's descriptions of Arata seemed so obviously exaggerated that many scholars assumed the whole thing was a tall tale, a mountain dream worked up by Sumerian bards to give their heroes an exotic backdrop. Fair enough. A mountain Shangri-La, after all, is a literary convention in a dozen cultures and not a historical fact in any of them. But then the floods happened, and then the gold turned up, and then the painted pottery, and then the crafts that were clearly good enough to travel. And suddenly the skeptical position started to look thin. The hypothesis that nothing had been there in the 3rd millennium started to feel less like sober scholarship and more like absence of evidence, mistaken for evidence of absence. You also have to ask the question from the other direction. If Arata is real, if it is somewhere in the Iranian highlands, why did the Sumerian texts describe it the way they did? Why did they care so much about its mountains? Why did so many of their poems about it take place on the road there? The answer is that the Sumerians were not naive about distance. They knew exactly how far it was. They knew the dangers. They knew what they were doing each time they sent a caravan, the way a modern shipper knows what they are doing when they send a container ship around the Cape of Good Hope. The poems they wrote about heroes like Lugalbanda on the road to Arata are not really poems about geography. They are poems about trade partnerships so valuable that the kings of the plain would risk thousands of lives moving goods across the mountains that stood between them and an ancient city of gold. The mountains in those poems are not scenery. They are the price of doing business, measured in human bodies. There is another piece of evidence that often goes undiscussed because it requires a closer reading of the original Sumerian. The Lord of Arata speaks in the epic, and his speeches are not different in tone or style from the speeches of the Lord of Uruk. They are not narrated as if the Lord of Arata is a god, or a magician, or a monster. He is treated as a ruler like other rulers. He has pride. He has interests. He bargains for barley because his own country, the highlands, do not grow enough of it. He demands tribute because that is what kings of his era do. He is human, in other words. He is a peer. And the entire epic takes the relationship between Uruk and Arata as a relationship between equal powers, two cities trying to work out a trade, occasionally fighting over it, but never in the entire thousands of lines of verse, treating either side as obviously inferior to the other. That detail, more than any amount of pottery or gold, has convinced some scholars that the Sumerians were describing a real place, not a literary invention. Mythical lands do not bargain over the price of barley. They send riddles, or they vanish, or they grant wishes. Arata negotiates. All of this should be enough, by itself, to make any curious person wonder what is happening in the Iranian highlands. But the modern story actually goes further than the Sumerian one. After the looting crisis of the 2000s, the Iranian government tightened control over the Jiroft site and designated a large area around the old excavations as a single archaeological zone. UNESCO placed the area on its tentative list for World Heritage status in 2014. International teams from Penn, from the French CNRS, from German and Italian universities have been digging there on and off since 2002, and they have been finding more year after year. They have found monumental architecture. They have found canals. They have found evidence of long-distance trade at the highest level. They have found seals with writing on them, writing that resembles writing found at other sites in the region, including writing that some specialists think may be linked to the early marks that some scholars have called Proto-Elamite. They have not found a gold cache as dramatic as the one that started the gold rush, but the bones of the civilization are turning up, steadily and repeatedly, in trench after trench. The infrastructure of a third millennium state is showing itself in fragments, the way foundations show themselves in older buildings, still recognizable, even after everything above them is gone. Which brings us back to the central mystery, the one that the inscriptions, after 4,000 years, are still pointing at. The inscriptions say there was a city called Arata. They say it was rich in gold, silver, copper, and lapis lazuli. They say it had walls that shimmered. They say it was home to the finest metalworkers in the ancient world. They say it sat in a high valley far to the east, deep in the mountains. They say the road to it ran through Susa. They say that when Sumerian kings sent messengers, they sometimes did not come back. They say the city defies our maps. They say it stood for centuries without leaving a hill behind. And yet, on a stretch of riverbank in southeastern Iran, in a region the Sumerians would have called the other side of the mountains, a civilization has begun to emerge from the silt that matches that description almost point for point. The pottery, the gold, the inscriptions, the lapis lazuli, the trade networks, the metal workshops, even the geography. These match the Sumerian descriptions of Arata point for point. But matching is not proving. The Sumerian texts describe Arata as a single grand city. Modern archaeology in the Halil Basin has so far revealed what looks less like a single capital, and more like a network of smaller centers spread across a fairly wide region. So maybe Arata really was a city, and we have not yet located the excavation site where the city will be found. Or maybe Arata was not a city at all, but a culture, a region, a cluster of towns the way the Nile Valley had many towns under one informal culture, the way the Indus Valley had many towns under another. Either interpretation would make sense in light of what we now know. But either interpretation also raises a different question, the kind of question this story really ends on. The geographic poetry could be describing a city or a culture, or the political center of a culture, and the archaeology would look slightly different in each case but consistent with all three readings. Because if Arata was a culture and not a city, then the Sumerian texts, which describe a city, are describing something more interesting than a town. They are describing the central capital of that culture in the way Greeks described Troy, the way Mesopotamian kings described Babylon, the way European poets described Rome. They are describing the heart of something larger, with all of its wealth and all of its rituals drawn inward toward a single point. And if that is true, then there is still a single fixed site out there somewhere in the Iranian highlands that will eventually be found. There was a real Arata. There was a real seat of power. There was a place the Sumerian envoys walked for months to reach. There was a lord of Arata who drank from a golden cup while deciding what to do about Enmerkar's last demand. There was a temple to Inanna, decorated with lapis, in a city surrounded by 7 mountain ranges. And there is a chance, a real, material, testable chance, that archaeologists will find it in our lifetime, just as the Sumerian poets ran out of songs to sing about it. The poems sound like an ending for a reason. They are an ending. We are just reading them from the wrong end of the timeline. And so the mystery is not really whether Arata existed. The texts are too specific. The geography is too detailed. The trade claims are too concrete. The mystery, if there is one, is whether we will know it when we see it. A city that lasted for centuries may not leave a hill. A city that traded copper may not leave copper objects in the layer right under the soil, because copper was always worth picking up. A city whose wealth was in precious trade goods may have dismantled itself in effect every time it fell into trouble, trading the cups, the bowls, the golden masks for what it needed to survive. Every time Arata was sacked, the valuables walked. Every time Arata was conquered, its lapis was already on the road. By the time any modern surveyor arrives, the site might look like just another stretch of highland ground, with nothing on the surface except a village and a few sheep paths. And yet, somehow the inscriptions made it through. A scholar, now long dead, sat at a desk in Berlin or Oxford or Istanbul in the late 19th century, deciphering wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay. He held the tablet up to the light. He read the names of kings, the names of cities, the names of mountains he had never heard of. He went to find them. The mountains were real, and he found them. The cities were not all real, but some were. And one of those cities, the one he wrote about most, the one he kept coming back to in his translations, the one whose name he could not find on any modern map, may now, after 4,000 years, be visible from a road in southeastern Iran, if only someone knew where to look. That is part of why this mystery is not like the others. Most lost cities are lost because they were destroyed. Arata, if it is what scholars now think it is, may have been lost because it was too successful. The land that fed Sumer, the land that gave Sumer its gold and silver, the land whose craftsmen made the sacred vases the temples of Inanna needed, was also the land whose treasures flowed outward, year after year, into the wider world. Every caravan that left Arata for Uruk took a little of Arata with it. Every successful trade reduced the central hoard. Eventually, the city was hollowed out by its own role in the trade. Eventually, the temple of Inanna in distant Uruk was richer than the temple of Inanna in Arata itself. Eventually, the empire on the plain became so strong that the empire on the mountain crumbled under the weight of its own export economies. And then, when the caravans stopped coming, when the bronze economy collapsed, when the tin routes shifted, when the climate changed, when the highlands emptied of people and the scribes of Uruk stopped writing poems about it, the city of Arata disappeared from memory. Not because it was a myth, because it had been so deeply woven into the real economy of its neighbors that, in the end, the indestructibles got carried away, the metals dispersed across a continent, the craftsmen wandered into new courts, and the stones got reset into jewelry whose owners had long stopped hearing the name of the place where it had first been cut. There's also a softer possibility. Maybe Arata was forgotten because the people who remembered it stopped having the time or the resources to write about it. Maybe the temples went quiet because the temples did not pay anymore. Maybe the writing stopped because the scribes moved to wherever the money was, and the money moved on.